Welcome to another episode of the Future Economies Start with Youth podcast. My name is Kevin Estasia, and today we're going to dive deep into the issues that most closely affect young people. Today, we're going to zoom in on the youth ambitions to have decency in work and how the private sector can partner with young people to offer decent employment. Most importantly, we will focus on what happens if decency gets overlooked by employers. Today, I have two very special women with me today. Patience Kikoni, a sustainable development expert, who will illustrate how Ugandan youth and employers navigate barriers to realizing decent work. And also Sonia van Lieshout, a decent work expert, who will share her expertise on how decent work is perceived internationally and why companies should prioritize creating decent work. Welcome so much, Sonia and Patience, and thank you so much for being here today. Let's start off immediately. It seems that decency forms a vital part in terms of youth employment dialogue currently. And I want to ask you, Patience, why do you think this has been starting to receive so much attention?
Thanks, Kevin. This is actually quite interesting. Every generation has its own ambitions and aspirations when it comes to employment. And a lot of youth today are interested in what we call decent employment. A group of Ugandan youth were asked, what does this decent employment actually mean? And whilst their responses varied from youth to youth, we saw a number of cross-cutting decency elements that came out in this research. And one of those elements is around job security. So job security is quite critical for youth. We saw elements like monthly income is also critical, but most importantly, we saw that youth actually are interested now more and more in getting these creative, spaces for innovation, spaces for creativity, and we saw most importantly as well that youth just want to be involved and included in, to take part in economic activities. So those are some of the findings and insights that came out of this research.
Okay, thank you so much. I heard you say that young people want to be included, and as Patience said that, I want to hear more about what young people want to say about this topic. So let's hear about their responses.
If I were a business owner, I'll make sure to develop the work culture of my workplace to center around creative thinking, innovation, technology, flexibility, and also having an environment where youth are able to express themselves better.
As a manager, I'm able to create a youth-friendly environment. It could boost and increase on the output ratio of the young person.
If I were a business owner, I promise you that I will hire young employees because they can bring fresh perspective and different way of thinking to my business. As you know, most young workers are eager to learn. They have energy. If they train a little, they do better than anyone.
I would be looking out for passion, not experience or knowledge, because I believe once someone has passion for something, they can actually go an extra mile to learn.
If I were a business manager, I could create a youth-friendly environment at the workplace.
Yeah, it's great to hear that inclusiveness, a conductive environment for development, and flexibility are important topics for decent work for youth. But at the same time, we must know that Africa is going through a huge wave of youth unemployment specifically and heightening of job insecurity. So I want to ask you, Patience, how are Ugandan youth aspirations for decent work being addressed in a time that might not allow for being too picky and too selective during a job search?
That's a good question, Kevin. And we're seeing more and more private sector trying to, pick up some of these insights, trying to understand more what are the needs and aspirations of youth. But I think there's an overall challenge around, there's a whole social cultural challenge and barrier that we still need to overcome. And when you look at in the context of Uganda, Kenya, most of Africa, and parts of Asia as well, we see that women and youth and particularly young women are still excluded a lot from this decent employment. So they're stuck in these traditional spaces that don't allow them to get a comfortable income, a decent income. And just take them away from domestic chores. So we need to first overcome these challenges first and foremost, but also private sector needs to listen more to the youth, either through connections to youth camps, youth networks, or things like that.
Okay, it's really interesting to hear how young people perceive decent employment. But Sonia, I want to ask you, do these perceptions of young people align with how international labor organizations view decency?
Yes, and thank you, Kevin, indeed. Yes and no, I would say, Kevin, because up to a certain point, everybody's, of course, interested in decent work. But what defines decent work? The London Metropolitan University actually did a research in 2012 where they researched the elements of what altogether combines their job quality. So they looked at elements, for example, like pension, job security, income, the quality of work, and those kind of things. And actually, it came from that research that the key findings established that when you look at diverse forms of work, like, for example, part-time work, but also temporary agency work, and of course also permanent work, that they are actually not so different when it comes to job quality and job security. So they're actually all more or less aligned, if legalized in the right way, of course. What was a big differentiator was bogus self-employment. And what we do see, of course, is that COVID-19 has hit hard, especially young people and women during the pandemic. And they have made them some sort of an outsider with regards to the labor market. So when we talk about diverse forms of work, it's an excellent stepping stone for them to get access to the labor market. And that drives the whole debate of permanent versus flexible work, diverse forms of work. And if you then look at the elements of job quality, then you have basically what we are talking about, decent work. And then I don't think that the expectations of youth is so much different than all of the other stakeholders on the labor market.
Okay, nice. And Sonia, you mentioned also income, and that ties into a living wage. And although decency and decent employment is a multi-layered concept, livable wage is a quite important part of that decency. So I want to ask you, what constitutes a living wage, a livable wage?
Very interesting question, Kevin, because up to this point, and reminder, we are in 2022 at this moment in time, we still don't have a legally recognized definition of a living wage. Not by the international institutions, nor by the global governmental institutions. So that makes it so difficult to talk about a living wage, actually. But all in all, if we take the forms of work which I've just mentioned, if legalized in the right way, then we also talk about, of course, minimum wages, statutory minimum wages, and everything beyond that is considered to be decent work and decent pay, fair remuneration, if we might say so. So in that sense, I think, although not legalized technically, it is there in terms of getting access to the labor market and getting a fair remuneration to the work that young people do, of course.
Okay, and I'm patient. Sonia talked about how talking about a living wage is quite difficult because there's no consensus on what the term actually means. But I want to ask you, how does the situation look like in Uganda?
Yeah, so I agree with Sonia. It is indeed a complex, living wage is indeed a complex concept altogether. And basically, in simple terms, it just means a remuneration that allows you to live a dignified life. In the perspective of youth, I think this means that they are not struggling, they can afford to cover their daily needs, and basically just enjoy and actually save for the future. So these are some of the elements that come out when we're talking about living wage in a perspective of youth. So now taking it to the concept of Uganda, we do not have any regulation when it comes to living wage, let alone minimum wage. And so the Challenge Fund for Youth Employment partnered with a strategy consulting firm, New Foresight, to understand what is the living wage in Uganda, and starting out with Mbale. This is a district in eastern Uganda. And what that study found was that living wage, based on a number of variables, I won't get into the methodology, but if we look at a household size of about 6 to 7 people in eastern Uganda, based on just a fairly comfortable life, we're looking at a monthly income of about $350. This is way higher than what an average Ugandan would earn typically. And also there are different other elements and circumstances around those kind of numbers.
Okay, and you mentioned some circumstances, and what are some of these circumstances?
Well, the most prominent one is gender. So gender is a very big, I had earlier talked about social cultural barriers, but if we look at Balloon Ventures specifically, this organization that was where this study was conducted, the organization supports small and growing businesses. If we look across those small and growing businesses, we see that female employees in those businesses earn way lower than their male counterparts. So those are some of the circumstances I'm talking about that just create this variance in wages.
Okay, and Sonia, many companies right now are in a post-pandemic recovery stage and are truly struggling to maintain their viability. Do you think that this is an extra challenging period for employers to focus on a livable wage, or perhaps this is the clean slate to implement changes to meet young people's aspirations for decent work?
I think that last one, Kevin, to be quite honest, because we know that labor shortages are being driven by demographic change, an aging society. Many people during the COVID-19 pandemic decided that they want to change jobs and that they want to pursue a different career in that sense. So for employers, it's very important to remain attractive to the labor market, to attract the right amount of talents, whether that's young talents or somewhat more mature talent. But they need to do everything in their power to attract and remain that talent. And decent wage is actually one of them in order to attract that talent and to retain that talent. And looking at Africa, we know, of course, that many young people, women too, are actually in the informal sector. And in order for them to bridge that labor market into the formal sector, I think that can also be a big driver for employers to support them with that. So decent work, coming from informality to a formal sector, I think those are all big components for employers to remain attractive and to attract the right talent, but also to retain them, of course, because that's the ultimate goal at this point in time.
Okay, nice. And Patience, I want to repeat the same question to you. Now that companies are in a post-pandemic recovery stage, do you think that this is more challenging, or is this the time for new implementation and much needed change?
So I'll just emphasize what Sonia just mentioned around retaining talent. I think looking beyond living wage, employers need to focus on the retention of young people, but also on the element of performing. So creating these safe spaces for young people to excel, to perform, the whole innovation, the whole creativity. I think just adding on to, Sonia elaborated on the retain bit, but I'll just emphasize, young people are looking for creativity, especially in Africa. How can they perform? How can we make spaces for women, especially young girls, that are, taking them out of their traditional spaces and more into these creative spaces that allow them still to be able to take part in domestic chores and give them time for their families and just help them earn a decent income out of these spaces. I think that's where private sector needs to focus on.
Okay, and now I started thinking, how about self-employed people and people working in the gig economy? How can we make sure that they are not left out of the decent work dialogues? Sonia?
Yeah, very fair question, Kevin, and a difficult one to answer, I might say so. Because when we talk about the gig economy, we instantly talk about self-employed. And we have to make a differentiation here, because when we talk about self-employed, from a Randstad perspective, we always make a differentiation between voluntary and involuntary self-employed, as we call it. Involuntary being bogus self-employed. So people being really pushed into self-employment in order to get access to the labor market, actually. Voluntary self-employment are, of course, those people at the higher part of the labor market. It's not necessarily only white-collar, can be blue-collar jobs as well, but really at the higher part of the labor market, earning a fair, decent income compared to those at the lower part of the labor market, mostly in bogus self-employment for that matter. Platform work is a good example for that, of course. We see a lot of people being pushed into platform work, for example, and there we can make a good differentiation. I mean, our company, for example, Randstad, we are one of the market leader when it comes to HR services, but also with regards to temporary agency work services. And what we do see is that most of the business models, the underlying business models of platform work, for example, they focus actually on self-employment or temporary agency work. And in order to ensure that level playing field, we need to address the type of business model that a certain platform work is providing towards these types of employees and workers. So coming to your question, Kevin, yes, I think it's necessary for self-employed to at least have access to collective bargaining rights. But that's only for the involuntary self-employment. That's for the bogus self-employment. Because if you are voluntary self-employed, you are already at that upper part of the labor market, earning more than a decent and living income. You're actually already earning a thriving income. So it's all those elements that we have to take into account when we talk about self-employed gig work with regards to decent work and a living wage.
Okay, very nice. And there's still a long way to go in terms of achieving decent work across continents, actually. And what you both mentioned today indicates that decent work has been on the public and the private agenda for quite some time now. But do you think that we're moving fast enough in terms of realizing decent work, Sonia?
Yes and no, to be quite honest, because when we were at the millennium in 2000, we said that labor laws were outdated because they dated back from actually the 60s, 70s last century already. Yeah. And now we are already in 2022 with more platform work and gig work than ever before. Yeah. So I think employers and workers have already realized the future of work, but the governmental institutions are still speeding up in order to look what kind of legislation and regulatory framework do we need in order to provide for employers and workers to be in that future of work. And I think we can all lend a hand there, of course, in order to reach that objective.
Okay, and Patience, do you think we're also moving fast enough, or do you share Sonia's idea?
Well, I think we could move faster, but most importantly, we should ensure that we leave no one behind. And by this, I mean just looking at youth. Big number of our youth are marginalized, particularly women. We could move faster, but just ensuring that we have everyone on board. From a private sector side, inclusion does come at a cost. We know that. But it is worth it in the end. We're seeing, once you get young people on board, listen to their aspirations, we are seeing a much stronger value proposition for these companies to include youth, whether it's through youth networks, through stronger youth collaboration. It is more beneficial for private sector. So we could move faster, and get everyone on board as well.
Okay, and Sonia, Patience mentioned collaboration. I want to ask you, how can young people collaborate with either companies or organizations to continue making sure that decent work is being implemented fast enough?
I think for that we also need public-private partnerships. Through public-private partnerships, we can, of course, reach out to the especially the marginalized groups within the labor market, women, but also young people in that sense. And I fully agree with Patience that this is the time to leave no one behind because we can't simply afford that anymore. With all the talent shortages going around, we need everybody on the labor market. And in order to bridge that step, public-private partnerships are essential to realize that. Also to reach out to youth, but also for you to reach out to them in order to get that connection to the labor market. So yeah, all about public-private partnerships in that sense.
Yeah, nice. And you mentioned also leaving no one behind, but that's quite important now because, as I mentioned before, most companies are in a post-pandemic recovery stage, and the most important thing is to having the labor needed to start up and come back to normal. So, Patience, I want to ask you, how can we make sure that I don't think leaving no one behind is possible, but how can we make sure that the least amount of people are left behind? So is that through education or making sure that jobs are accessible? How do you see that?
So I think the pandemic has actually given us an impetus for this. So it's been a blessing in disguise. Sonia talked about self-employment. I think it's created more and more of that flexibility. It's also, I won't focus on the negative of pushing more people down in the marginalized, but I think, we can leverage off the flexibility and get more people in self-employed roles, in agricultural roles for women, and just increasing the number of jobs that we create.
Okay, and Sonia, how do you see what the picture that Patience drew? How do you see that?
I actually fully agree, because I think providing that access to the labor market is a big step, of course. Coming from the informal to the formal sector is another big step. Public-private partnerships in that sense. Really try everything in terms of putting effective labor market policies to be implemented in the labor market in order to, as you say, to leave no one behind, but make sure that at least as maximum as people as we can reach out to are actually reached out to in that sense, in order to get them to the labor market and to really be in those decent jobs in order for them to earn a fair remuneration. Apologies for my English here, and to get into work at first, because as we always say, it starts with work, then on to a job, and then on to a career. And that's the thing we would like to achieve, of course.
Okay, thank you so much. Leave no one behind. You've heard it here first. Leave no one behind. But how can we do that? We have to focus on making sure that public and private partnerships are active. And how can we make sure that that is happening? Through having young people at the table, meaningful youth engagement, and making sure that young people, the ones being affected, have something to say and are being actively engaged in these conversations. Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you so much, Sonia and Patience, for being here and giving us your expertise. You guys are amazing, and I can see that the world has two great experts working on education, decent work, and economy. And thank you much, viewers and listeners, for listening to the Future Economies Start with Youth podcast. And of course, I'll see you next time.